You are standing in a factory in 1914. The air smells like machine oil and hot metal. A man named Henry Ford has just announced something that will make every other industrialist in America furious. He is going to pay his workers $5 a day, double the going rate. Newspapers call him a traitor to his class. Other factory owners predict he will be bankrupt within a year, but Ford is not confused. He is not being generous. He has just realized something that most people still do not understand today. If his workers cannot afford to buy the cars they are building, his entire empire collapses. The rich do not just need poor people to work for them, they need poor people to buy from them. And that single uncomfortable fact is the hinge on which almost the entire global economy quietly turns. Let's start with what most people assume, because it is almost completely wrong. The assumption is that wealth and poverty exist side by accident, that some people got lucky, worked hard, made smart choices, and others did not, that the rich would be just as rich if poverty vanished tomorrow. Economists have been quietly dismantling this idea for over 200 years, and the data is not subtle. Here is the first piece. Wages. In 1968, the University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman, no radical by any measure, wrote plainly that a pool of available, replaceable labor is what keeps wages from rising. Karl Marx, writing a century earlier in Capital, called this the reserve army of labor. Different politics, same observation. If every single low-wage worker in a country suddenly had a better option, wages for the remaining workers would be forced upward because employers would have to compete for people instead of the other way around. A 2019 study from the Economic Policy Institute found that from 1979 to 2018, productivity in the United States grew by 69.6%, while typical worker pay rose by just 11.6%. That gap, the space between what workers create and what they are paid, does not vanish. It becomes profit, and profit only grows that large if there is always another worker willing to take the job for less. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable. This is not a conspiracy. Nobody needs to sit in a room and plan it. It happens automatically, the same way water finds the lowest point. Wherever there is a surplus of people who need income more than employers need any specific one of them, wages stay low almost by physics. Economists call this labor supply elasticity. The less bargaining power workers have, the more of what they produce stays with the people who own the business. This is not opinion. This is Econ 101 taught in university lecture halls every single semester, just rarely connected out loud to the word poverty. But wages are only half the story. Here is the second piece, and it is the one almost nobody talks about. Consumption. In 2020, researchers at the UC Berkeley Labor Center calculated that low-wage workers at companies like Walmart and McDonald's relied on $6.2 billion a year in public assistance, food stamps, Medicaid, housing support, just to survive on the wages those companies paid them. Read that again. Taxpayers were subsidizing the difference between what massive, profitable corporations paid their workers and what those same workers needed to live. That is not a loophole. That is a business model. Pay low enough that the public safety net absorbs the gap, keep the difference as profit. This has a name in economics. It is called a wage subsidy in reverse. The poor are not a drain on the rich. In this arrangement, the poor are quietly subsidizing them. And there's a third piece that connects everything: debt. The average American household carried over $6,500 in credit card debt in 2023, according to the Federal Reserve. Interest on that debt does not vanish. It flows somewhere. It flows to banks, to shareholders, to the same wealth concentration we started with. The economist Thomas Piketty spent an entire 800-page book, Capital in the 21st Century, published in 2013, proving with tax records from 20 countries spanning 2 centuries that returns on capital consistently outpace economic growth. Translation: if you already own things, stocks, property, businesses, your wealth grows faster than the wages of the people working for you ever can. And the interest paid by people who do not have enough is one of the quiet engines making that possible. So let's put the whole machine together, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Poor people work for wages low enough that a business can turn a profit. Poor people then spend nearly all of that income immediately because they have to, which keeps consumer demand alive for the very products the rich are selling. When wages fall short of survival, poor people borrow, and that debt generates interest that flows upward. And when the gap becomes too wide to survive on wages or debt alone, taxpayers, most of whom are not rich, quietly fill in the rest through public assistance. Every single stage of this cycle moves resources in the same direction, not because of a plan, because of a structure that has existed since the first factory owner realized a starving worker will accept any wage and a comfortable one will not. Now, some of you are thinking, but if poverty vanished, wouldn't everyone just be more prosperous, rich people included? This is where history gives us a strange answer. Look at Henry Ford again. He was right about one thing. Wealthy people do need customers, and customers need money. But here is what he was not saying out loud. He needed workers who had just enough to buy a Model T, not workers with so much security that they could refuse the job, negotiate their hours, or start a competing company next door. The system does not need poverty in the sense of starvation. It needs precarity. People close enough to the edge that they will show up, comply, and spend, but never quite secure enough to walk away. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this video. It is not that the rich need suffering, it is that the entire structure depends on people staying just unstable enough to need what is being offered. This shows up historically over and over. During the Industrial Revolution in Britain, factory owners in Lancashire actively lobbied against rising agricultural wages in the countryside, because a comfortable rural population had less incentive to move into the cities and work 14-hour shifts in the mills. A well-fed peasant was bad for business. A desperate one was ideal. This is documented extensively in E.P. Thompson's 1963 study, The Making of the English Working Class, which traces how enclosure laws deliberately stripped rural communities of self-sufficient land access, pushing them into wage labor they otherwise would have avoided. And this brings us to the question nobody wants to ask out loud. Is poverty an accident, or is it, at some level, functional? Not planned by any single villain twirling a mustache in a boardroom, but structurally convenient, generation after generation, for whoever sits at the top of the arrangement. Economist John Kenneth Galbraith argued in his 1958 book The Affluent Society that modern economies had become remarkably efficient at generating wealth, yet remained strangely committed to unequal distribution of it, not because equality was impossible, but because the existing arrangement served the people with the power to change it. So here is the uncomfortable truth this video keeps circling back to. The rich do not need poor people to exist out of cruelty. They need them out of structure. A workforce that will accept low wages because the alternative is worse. A customer base that will keep spending because saving is not an option. A borrower base that will keep paying interest because credit is the only bridge between one paycheck and the next. And a taxpayer base that will quietly cover whatever gap remains, so the system never has to break. None of this means individual wealthy people are villains. And none of this means individual poor people are powerless. But it does mean the story you were told that wealth and poverty are simply the natural result of effort and choice is missing the machinery underneath it. The machinery that needs both ends of the ladder to keep functioning exactly the way it does. So the next time someone tells you the poor are a burden on the economy, remember Henry Ford standing in his factory in 1914, doing math that had nothing to do with kindness. He was not being generous. He understood something that the entire system has known since the first factory whistle blew. Without someone at the bottom, there is no top. That is not an insult. That is the blueprint, quietly running underneath everything you were told was simply the free market.